If you're enjoying this tale from the Old West, please hit that like button and subscribe to our channel for more incredible stories of frontier justice and courage. Your support keeps these forgotten legends alive for future generations to discover and appreciate. The dust settled on Millbrook Valley as the sun cast long shadows across the weathered planks of the Henderson homestead. Martha Henderson stood at her kitchen window, her bruised hands trembling, as she watched a lone rider approach through the amber evening light. 3 months had passed since her husband Thomas died in that mining accident, leaving her alone with their infant daughter Sarah and his bitter, cruel mother, who blamed Martha for every misfortune that had befallen their family. Eleanor Henderson was a woman carved from granite and spite, her sharp tongue as cutting as any blade forged in the territory. From the moment Martha had married Thomas, the old woman had made it clear that she was an unwelcome addition to the Henderson name. When Sarah was born, a beautiful, healthy girl with her father's gentle eyes, Eleanor's resentment turned to pure venom. In her twisted mind, Martha's failure to produce a male heir was the ultimate betrayal of the Henderson legacy. The beatings had started 2 weeks after Thomas's funeral. Eleanor would find any excuse, any small imperfection in Martha's housekeeping or child-rearing to justify her cruelty. A burnt biscuit would earn Martha a slap across the face. A crying baby would result in Eleanor's walking stick striking Martha's back until she collapsed in tears. The neighbors knew but turned their heads, unwilling to interfere in what they considered a family matter in those harsh frontier times. Martha had nowhere to run. She owned nothing, had no family of her own, and the nearest town was 40 miles through dangerous territory. Eleanor controlled every penny of Thomas's modest inheritance and made it clear that if Martha ever tried to leave, she would ensure that both Martha and little Sarah would starve on the unforgiving prairie. The old woman held all the power, and she wielded it with the precision of a seasoned executioner. The rider dismounted near the front porch, his spurs jingling softly against the wooden steps. Martha recognized him immediately, though she hadn't seen him in nearly 5 years. Jake Morrison had been Thomas's closest friend since childhood, a man who had left Millbrook Valley to try his luck in the California goldfields. His weathered face bore the marks of hard living, and his eyes held a steely determination that hadn't been there when he was young. Eleanor emerged from the back room, her cane tapping against the floor with menacing rhythm. She had heard the horse approaching and was already preparing her usual performance of grieving mother-in-law, ready to paint Martha as the ungrateful burden who had brought nothing but sorrow to their family. But when she saw Jake standing in the doorway, his tall frame silhouetted against the dying light, her expression shifted to something Martha had never seen before. Uncertainty, perhaps even fear. Jake removed his hat respectfully, but his voice carried an edge that cut through the evening air like winter wind. He had ridden hard for 3 days after receiving word of Thomas's death and the situation that had developed in his absence. A traveling merchant had told him about the bruises on Martha's face, the way she flinched when anyone approached too quickly, and how Eleanor Henderson had transformed from a merely difficult woman into something far more sinister. The conversation that followed was tense and loaded with unspoken threats. Eleanor tried to maintain her authority, insisting that Martha was her responsibility and that Jake had no business interfering in Henderson family affairs. But Jake had seen enough of the world to recognize cruelty when he encountered it, and he had also seen enough violence to know how to handle those who inflicted it on the innocent. His hand never moved toward his gun, but the promise of consequences hung heavy in the air. Martha watched from the corner, holding Sarah close to her chest, afraid to hope but unable to look away. For months she had prayed for deliverance, for someone to see through Eleanor's facade and recognize the terror that had become her daily existence. Jake's arrival felt like an answer to those desperate prayers, but she had learned not to trust in rescue after so many disappointments and broken promises from neighbors who claimed they would help. Jake's ultimatum was simple and direct. Eleanor would cease her abuse immediately, or she would face consequences that extended far beyond the boundaries of Millbrook Valley. He had connections now, men who owed him favors from his years in the mining camps, and he was prepared to use every one of them if necessary. Eleanor's face turned ashen as she realized that her victim now had a protector, someone who wouldn't be intimidated by her threats or manipulated by her lies about family duty and proper behavior. The old woman's bluster crumbled like a house of cards in a desert windstorm. Without Thomas to shield her and no other family members to support her version of events, Eleanor found herself facing the prospect of social ostracism and potentially worse. Jake made it clear that Martha and Sarah were now under his protection and that any further abuse would be met with swift and decisive retaliation. The era of unchecked cruelty was coming to an end. That night, as Eleanor retreated to her room in sullen defeat, Jake sat on the front porch with Martha, explaining his plan. He had done well for himself in California and was prepared to help Martha establish her independence. There was a teaching position available in Sacramento, a chance for her to build a new life far from the memories and pain of Millbrook Valley. For the first time in months, Martha allowed herself to believe in the possibility of freedom. The next morning brought a scene that Martha would remember for the rest of her life. Eleanor emerged from her room with her usual scowl, her cane raised as if to strike Martha for some imagined transgression. But before the blow could fall, Jake's voice cut through the morning air with quiet authority. "No more beatings," he said, his words carrying the weight of absolute certainty. Eleanor's hand froze mid-swing, and slowly she lowered the cane. From that moment forward, the dynamic in the Henderson household changed completely. Eleanor spoke in clipped, careful sentences, her venomous tongue finally bridled by the presence of someone who wouldn't tolerate her cruelty. Martha began to move through the house without the constant fear of violence, and little Sarah seemed to sense the change, crying less frequently and smiling more often at her mother's renewed confidence and hope. Jake spent the following weeks making arrangements for Martha's departure. He negotiated with Eleanor regarding Martha's share of Thomas's modest estate, using a combination of legal knowledge gained during his travels and thinly veiled threats to ensure a fair settlement. The old woman, faced with the choice between compromise and potential exposure of her abusive behavior, chose to cooperate rather than face the consequences of continued defiance and public scrutiny. The day of departure arrived with the crisp clarity of early autumn. Martha packed her few possessions and bundled Sarah carefully for the long journey westward. Eleanor watched from the window, her face a mask of impotent rage and bitter defeat. She had lost control of her victim and with it, the sense of power that had sustained her through her own disappointments and failures. The woman who had terrorized Martha for months now seemed small and pathetic, diminished by the exposure of her cruelty. As the wagon rolled away from the Henderson homestead, Martha looked back only once. The house that had been her prison for nearly a year grew smaller in the distance, along with the memories of fear and pain that had defined her existence since Thomas's death. Ahead lay uncertainty, but it was uncertainty filled with possibility rather than the certainty of continued suffering. Jake rode alongside the wagon, his presence a constant reminder that she was no longer alone. The journey to California took 3 weeks, during which Martha gradually shed the submissive, frightened demeanor that had become second nature during her time under Eleanor's thumb. Jake proved to be a patient and understanding companion, never pushing her to talk about her experiences, but always available when she needed to voice her fears or hopes for the future. Sarah thrived during the journey, her infant curiosity awakened by the changing landscapes and her mother's renewed vitality. Sacramento proved to be everything Jake had promised and more. The teaching position was real, the pay was fair, and the community welcomed Martha with warmth and respect. For the first time since her marriage, she found herself valued for her intelligence and abilities rather than judged solely on her capacity to produce male heirs. The other teachers became her friends, and slowly she began to rebuild her confidence and sense of self-worth. Years passed, and Martha established herself as one of Sacramento's most respected educators. Sarah grew into a bright, curious child who showed no signs of the trauma she might have absorbed during those terrible months in Millbrook Valley. Jake became a regular visitor, eventually becoming something more than just a protector and friend. Their relationship developed slowly, built on mutual respect and genuine affection rather than desperation or convenience, creating a foundation for lasting happiness. Meanwhile, back in Millbrook Valley, Eleanor Henderson lived out her remaining years as a bitter, isolated woman. Without a victim to terrorize, she turned her venom inward, becoming increasingly reclusive and suspicious of everyone around her. The community gradually learned the truth about how she had treated Martha, and the social consequences were severe. She died alone in the house that had once echoed with the sounds of violence, her legacy one of cruelty and wasted opportunity for redemption. Martha never returned to Millbrook Valley, but she kept in touch with some of the more sympathetic neighbors who had eventually found the courage to admit they had known about the abuse but done nothing to stop it. Their letters carried news of Eleanor's decline and eventual death, but Martha felt no satisfaction in her former tormentor's fate. She had moved beyond the need for revenge, finding peace in her new life and the knowledge that she had broken free from the cycle of abuse. The story of Martha Henderson became something of a legend in Sacramento, whispered among women who faced their own struggles with abusive family members or difficult circumstances. It served as proof that escape was possible, that there were still good people in the world willing to stand up for those who couldn't protect themselves. Martha's classroom became a refuge for children from troubled homes, and her gentle but firm approach to discipline showed them that authority didn't have to be cruel to be effective. Jake and Martha eventually married in a simple ceremony surrounded by their chosen family of friends and colleagues. Sarah, now old enough to understand the significance of the moment, served as the flower girl, her bright smile a testament to the healing power of love and safety. The wedding was everything Eleanor's son Thomas had never been able to give Martha, a celebration of partnership and equality rather than duty and submission to patriarchal expectations. As Martha stood in her wedding dress, looking out at the faces of people who genuinely cared for her happiness, she thought back to that terrible day when Eleanor's cane had been raised to strike her for the last time. Jake's simple words, "No more beatings," had been more than just a command to stop the immediate violence. They had been a declaration that her life had value, that she deserved dignity and respect, and that there were still people in this harsh world willing to fight for justice and compassion. What do you think was the most powerful moment in Martha's journey from victim to survivor? Was it Jake's intervention, her decision to accept his help and leave Millbrook Valley, or perhaps her eventual success as an educator in Sacramento? Share your thoughts in the comments below about what aspect of this frontier tale of courage and redemption resonated most strongly with you.